Ambassador Kurtzer?
Yes, Peter, hi.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be talking to you. I'm Peter Beinart of Open Zion. I'm talking to Ambassador Kurtzer, who's had a very distinguished diplomatic career, which included being ambassador to both Egypt and Israel, and is now associated with Princeton, and has edited a very significant new book called Pathways to Peace, America and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. I thought I would start, since it's obviously so much dominated the news, by talking to you a little bit about when the dust settles in this war between Israel and Hamas, what, if anything, do you think will be changed in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian and larger Israeli-Arab conflict?
Well, the real question, Peter, is whether this is simply going to be round 3 or 4 of an eternal boxing match between Israel and elements of Palestinian society, in which, in the course of time, the Palestinians arm themselves, frustration builds, they attack Israel, Israel responds, and then there's a period of lull until the next round, or whether or not cooler heads will prevail and everyone decides to actually try to get to the underlying issues. The issue that Washington always prefers to ignore is the underlying Arab-Israeli conflict, especially the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In this particular round of fighting, Israel against Hamas, Israel will undoubtedly prevail militarily, and Hamas will undoubtedly have its military capabilities degraded. But Hamas is going to come out with a political victory, having garnered support in the Arab world. And one of the losers is going to be Israel's peace partner, Mahmoud Abbas, of the Palestinian Authority. The question then is, can smart minds come together and figure out a way in which not only can Israel win politically, not just militarily, but in which the Palestinian Authority and the PLO can also emerge in a stronger position able to negotiate?
So am I right in gleaning from that answer that your view would be that Hamas should be kept at a distance, that the policy that the U.S. and Israel have been pursuing for the past few years of no negotiations with Hamas until Hamas meets a series of criteria that they don't seem likely to meet anytime soon, including respecting past peace agreements, renouncing violence, and accepting Israel's right to exist, that basically we should not have any interactions with Hamas in the near future?
Look, I think they're two different issues. I think the conditions are reasonable for any party that wants to come into the peace process. You can't enter a peace process if ultimately you're not going to accept the legitimacy of your partner, you're not going to renounce violence, and if you're not going to commit to accept and implement agreements previously entered into. But we've set the conditions in such a way that it's all or nothing. And my problem with the conditions is not the unreasonableness of them, but the fact that there's no pathway that makes it even possible for Hamas to meet those conditions. To expect that Hamas is going to wake up one morning and say yes to all 3 of those requirements, I think, is unrealistic. And so I would like to see a more textured and nuanced approach in which there's a kind of response that we're able to make if Hamas starts to move in the direction of addressing those conditions. And I don't think we've given any thought to that. It's kind of establishing milestones along the way and showing Hamas both the pathway to achieving ultimately what they want, but also what they can gain in the meantime should they start to move in the right direction.
You said giving Hamas a pathway to what they ultimately want, but there are many, as you know, who would say that what they ultimately want is only one state, which means the end of Israel. Do you think there has been significant movement within Hamas towards a real acceptance of the idea of a two-state solution in recent years?
I don't know, and I'd want to be real careful about committing to whatever Hamas says today as meaning what it ultimately will accept. We know, for example, when Khalid Mashal was still in the leadership of Hamas, he always played with words when he was asked this question. He talked about a willingness to accept a state in the 1967 boundaries as a first step, with the implication being that Hamas would have further demands down the road. And the question then is whether or not we're prepared to take first steps and see whether behaviors, in fact, impact on the willingness of an organization like Hamas to change. The focus that I would like to maintain is on the Palestinian Authority and the PLO. This discussion of Hamas is important, but to the extent that we continue to only focus on decisions that Hamas makes, we're losing track of the fact that the legitimate negotiating partner of Israel is the PLO.
But, I mean, let me just, again, I agree with you about 98% of things, but on at least related to this. But let me just, in the spirit of devil's advocate a little bit, how can we say that Mahmoud Abbas and the PA or the PLO are the legitimate negotiating partner when they lost an election and when Abbas has his term expired years and years ago, and basically he's only staying in power essentially against the wishes of, to some degree, of the Palestinian people, because we and other Western countries, and to some degree Israel, are propping him up?
Well, first of all, he didn't lose an election. The Hamas prevailed in legislative elections.
Yes, but he hasn't been willing to run for re-election himself.
Right.
His term expired, 3 or 4 years
right.
ago?
Right, and in large part also because, not just his own reticence, but also because Hamas is not prepared to play by the rules of the game, that they're unsure of the outcome. Palestinian politics...
I mean, they don't want elections either.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Palestinian politics is as convoluted as Israeli politics, and, it's not easy to divine the real meanings here. The fact is, you work with, the party that you came to the dance with, and Israel came to the dance with the PLO, and until there is an alternative leadership recognized by the Palestinian people and the international community as reflecting Palestinian aspirations, the PLO should be seen as the negotiating partner.
But doesn't this give Hamas every incentive to try to destroy any progress that Israel would make with Mahmoud Abbas, because essentially you're leaving them out in the cold? Well,
it certainly complicates Abbas's efforts. I don't want to minimize the challenge he faces in trying to negotiate over a territory, Gaza, that he doesn't control, or a half of the population of Palestine that he doesn't control. But at least in terms of what he says, Abbas is ready to take on that challenge. And at least by virtue of what Hamas says, they may be willing to allow Abbas to give it a shot, not supporting him, but in their belief that he will ultimately fail, but at least he'd have a little bit of space in which to operate. I don't think we've tested this proposition seriously. After all, Abbas negotiated quite seriously in 2008 after Hamas's takeover of Gaza. So there is precedent for serious negotiations to take place, even with Hamas in control of Gaza.
As you know, an argument one hears very often in the Jewish community is that Mahmoud Abbas is not serious about wanting a peace agreement because he's not been willing to directly negotiate with Israel. What's your perspective on that?
Well, it's a nonsense argument. He has negotiated directly with Israel, and he's done everything that Israelis have asked him to do. He was opposed to the Second Intifada. He broke with Arafat over that question. He opposes resuming violence, as he said just a few weeks ago. He has talked now openly about the sacred right of return, and he has basically given up his own right of return, even if he stops short of committing the Palestinian Authority to do so. This is a man who is, he's done what the Israelis have asked him to do. So to raise these kinds of questions is not so much an indictment of Abbas as it is about the people who are asking the questions. The answer to those people basically is, well, test him. Get into a serious negotiation without preconditions. Pick up where you left off in 2008, which both sides at that time suggested were quite advanced talks, and see whether or not they can be consummated. If they can't be consummated because of Palestinian intransigence, okay, then we know where we are. But I would not set up all these roadblocks, including these rhetorical roadblocks, blaming Abbas for something that he's not guilty of.
But would you advise him to give up on the settlement freeze as a precondition for direct talks with Israel?
Yeah, I think both the United States and Abbas got into a bit of a blind alley in promoting it as a prerequisite for negotiations. I've been a long-term critic of the settlements policy. I've written very strong articles about it, spoken out publicly. So if I argue not to make a settlements freeze a precondition, it's not because I don't think the settlements issue is important. I don't think, however, that you need to set up a unchangeable roadblock, such as a complete settlements freeze, which you know in advance any Israeli prime minister is not going to be able to deliver on. Netanyahu delivered on a freeze on settlement starts for a 10-month period. That was the most he could do. Maybe you could get a little bit more out of him, but why waste the energy on these preconditions when we know from the 2008 talks that the parties had made progress on the core four issues? In the context of negotiations, I would go back to the roadmap obligations to reduce and ultimately stop settlement activity, as well as the obligations on Palestinians. But I think it was a faulty tactic to make that a precondition for the negotiations themselves.
But in May of last year, Obama seemed to try to set up negotiations just based on the idea that everyone would agree to the 67 lines plus swaps. And as you know, Benjamin Netanyahu very publicly rejected that. So do you see any evidence from this Israeli prime minister that he is interested in going back to the kind of, from an Israeli perspective, pretty far-reaching concessions that Ehud Olmert seemed to be willing to make?
Well, you don't see it. You certainly didn't see it before the Gaza flare-up. It remains to be tested whether Gaza has changed his mind. But even assuming that it hasn't changed his mind, I think all three of the parties in May of 2011 didn't quite do what they needed to do. The president put forward a very good idea: start with borders and security, and start the borders talks on the basis of the 67 lines with a commitment to swaps, and then he abandoned it in the face of opposition. United States policy is not out there for a one-shot deal. If it is our policy to use this as a mechanism to start negotiations, then it ought to be sustained, and we ought to do the kinds of things that we can do, rhetorical pressures and otherwise, to get people to buy into what is a very reasonable way to start negotiations. Netanyahu, of course, pushed back, and I think that was wrong, and we have to work with him to get him to a point where he will hopefully agree. And frankly, Abbas didn't react well by, again, restating the condition of the precondition of a settlements freeze. So it was kind of a bad episode, but it doesn't mean that the idea necessarily gets discarded. It was a good idea, and I think it's worth re-examining in a new context now.
So, but it does beg the question, if Obama threw this out there, and as you said, neither Netanyahu nor Abbas responded in the way you think they should have, and you suggested that there should be rhetorical pressure and then this, to me, tantalizing word otherwise, kind of mechanisms. I guess let me get you in trouble here. I mean, what exactly should the United States do in order to get an Israeli prime minister and perhaps also a Palestinian leader who were not willing to respond to the way we wanted to this, what you said was a very reasonable proposal of 67 parameters plus swaps as negotiations? How are we going to get to do it now? Yeah,
the swagger that we exercised in 1990-91 to bring about the Madrid Peace Conference derived from a number of factors, but I would say the most important one of those factors was the fact that it was the United States committed to a good idea, and ultimately not just Yitzhak Shamir, who was as tough as Bibi Netanyahu is today, but we also brought Hafez al-Assad and ultimately the Palestinians on board. Now, one could play with the idea of you got pressures in column A and inducements in column B, and I can assure you that there are lists galore of such ideas out there. But that's not, and I'm not just trying to avoid, I think I just lost our video here.
Oh, I'm still here. Are you here?
Yeah.
Oh, you lost
Yeah,
the video?
no, I think we're back now.
Okay.
I don't avoid enumerating them simply to stay safe, but you don't go into this negotiation brandishing either your weapons or your incentives. You go into this negotiation as the United States of America with a determined president, a determined Secretary of State, a policy that's sustainable, that can get broad support in Congress, which I think we can get, even though we have a divided Congress, and a policy that is marketable to the Israeli and Palestinian populations. None of the things that we've done in the last couple of years has been marketable because they've been individual pieces of policy. But if the United States has a policy that says this is the way we think things should be going, these are the ways in which we can bring additional parties into the process, such as activating the Arab Peace Initiative. This is ways we can help the Palestinian Authority continue to build towards statehood. In other words, you have an integrated approach across the board. You've got something to sustain your diplomacy. At moments, you may need to use those inducements or those pressures, and they're not going to be hard to figure out at that time. But that's not the key. You don't go into this kind of brandishing your weapons or your pocketbook. You go into this with determination to act like the great power that we are and to do the diplomacy that we have shown in the past we're capable of doing.
So let me try to do my best impression of what I could imagine Benjamin Netanyahu saying to the American diplomat who wants to go full steam ahead. He would say, look, you want me to give up control, take the IDF out of the Jordan Valley, and allow the Palestinians to have a state in the West Bank and various kind of supposed restrictions on their sovereignty that I have no ability to guarantee afterwards, and place my faith in Mahmoud Abbas. Perfectly nice man. You and I both know he's yesterday's news. He's not the future of where the Palestinian national movement is. I think I'm going to have Hamas and Islamic Jihad there in the West Bank. And you tell me why an Israeli prime minister should risk having Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, maybe ruling the West Bank, Hamas, with an open border to the rest of the Arab world. Why should I risk Israel like that?
Peter, you're throwing me softballs, and I don't think Bibi would throw such a softball to me. The reality is that every time Israel has entered into an agreement with an Arab neighbor, until now, it has been sustained with ups and downs and with warm and cold and hot peace or whatever you want to call it. But agreements reached between Israel and its neighbors have worked. Unilateral actions undertaken by Israel or its neighbors have not worked. The ultimate goal here is to reach an agreement in which you not only have a so-called Palestinian partner, but you have a responsible party on the other side of a recognized border who has to take responsibility for what happens there. Now, we also know that there will be layer upon layer of assurances that will help Israel overcome very legitimate security concerns. There will be international involvement at every stage of this process, as well as at every level of this process. There will be direct United States involvement with respect to what we do bilaterally with Israel. We're talking about probably significant amounts, not only of aid, but of other kinds of assistance that we can provide to give Israel substitute mechanisms for what it currently enjoys on the ground. Where it has a troop station, we may be able to find alternatives. We're not asking Israel simply to pick up one day and walk out and throw the keys over the fence and hope that things work out. So if we want to talk seriously about this, we're talking about an agreement in which the toughest issues in this conflict get worked through. Issues related to refugees and settlements and security and borders and Jerusalem. And at the end of the day, if we do have an agreement, you have two parties willing to commit themselves to implement it with the international community as a witness and the United Nations as a witness. It's not so simple to declare that to be a risk not worth taking.
Okay, so let me try to play now the left-wing Palestinian. Maybe they wouldn't be in the room, but they'd certainly be saying lots of things from the sidelines. And they would say, look, Mr. Kurtzer or whichever American diplomat is, you're a very nice person. But we Palestinians watched Israel's government virtually fall when Israel just tried to get rid of a few homes in Migron, which was an illegal outpost illegal under Israeli law that the Supreme Court had told them they could demolish. The only way they could do it was to physically move those homes to a different location, still inside the settlement. So you're telling us that Israel's going to dismantle Ariel, 20,000 people, they've just built a university there. We can't accept a settlement like Ariel, which really causes us contiguity problems. What possible evidence is there for us to believe that Israel ever would have the will or even capacity to be able to do the kind of things that we allow us to have a viable state?
Every time Israel has signed an agreement, it has implemented it, even when it required some very difficult choices. You remember in Sinai, which doesn't have the same emotional, historical, religious connection as the West Bank, but in Sinai, no less a figure than Moshe Dayan said that it's better to hold Sharm el-Sheikh without peace than to have peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. And ultimately, Israel doesn't have Sharm el-Sheikh. The point is that if you disaggregate these issues, if you deconstruct these issues and take them sequentially, you're right. We'll never get to a solution. Because trying to work out a solution only on Jerusalem, only on refugees, only on settlements, brings to the fore the worst fears and concerns of both parties. What happened in 2008 was really quite interesting. Polling that took place in both constituencies revealed that when you took an individual issue before the Israeli or Palestinian public, hardline positions emerged. When you put together a reasonable package, 60 to 70% of both communities understood that these involved trade-offs, and they ended up supporting the package. Now, I'm not a naive believer in the power of negotiations, but since we haven't tried them seriously for 4 years, and our last experience was not negative, I say to myself, why not give it a shot, and why not try, and answer the critics on the Palestinian left and the Israeli right by seeing whether we can hammer out a reasonable and fair agreement, put it before both peoples, before the Knesset, before a referendum, whatever mechanism on the Israeli side, before the Legislative Council or the Palestine National Council, or referendum on the Palestinian side, and let's see whether people are ready to buy into something that requires them to give up a lot, but also gain something for them. We haven't even tried that, Peter.
And when you say a Palestinian referendum, do you imagine including the Palestinians in the refugee camps outside the West Bank and Gaza in that as well? Because that's what Hamas would, I think, publicly states.
Well, I think you have to. For this to be credible, you can't leave any hanging chads out there. I think the Palestinian diaspora will have to be involved. Frankly, I think parts of the Jewish diaspora are also going to demand involvement. After all, Jerusalem is an issue, for example, that has stakeholders beyond just the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. There are religious stakeholders and there are international stakeholders. So I don't know how do you construct such a complicated mechanism, but I think the referendum will have to go beyond simply the occupied territories.
Well, since you mentioned Jewish religious opinion, let me play a different character for you. Someone from your own Orthodox Jewish community. He says, "Look, Ambassador Kurtzer, we just recently read Parshas Chaya Sarah. You're basically telling, right, which tells us about the sanctity of the city of Hebron and the cave of the Machpelah, and you're basically telling us that to leave those areas and leave those sacred Jewish sites to a Palestinian leadership, and we believe that they're going to be turned into, they're going to be trashed. That Jews are going to lose access to those things, and they're going to be desecrated in ways that would be really horrific for us. So how, as people who care about that, who believe that land and those sites are precious to us, are you going to take that risk?"
Whether or not Israel controls those sites, they're going to remain holy for people in the Jewish tradition, just as whether or not Muslims control religious sites in Israel, those sites are going to remain religious. It's going to be the obligation of governments to protect those sites. The negotiations are going to have to provide mechanisms to give assurances to it. And that means also the ability of pilgrims of whatever faith to visit these holy sites. It does not require the sovereignty of a particular state that confers the sanctity of the place. And the same values that are provided in our tradition for particular places and their holiness also provide a value foundation for issues related to peace, justice, and treating other people well. So I don't like to pick and choose that the value of land trumps the value of everything else. If we have a holistic approach to our own tradition and we expect Muslims to have a holistic approach to theirs, then it may be that we don't actually exercise physical control over a holy site, but that site should be respected by anyone of any religious temperament and under any government's authority.
All right, so let me don one more character. This is the political advisor in the White House who says, wait a second, you want to pick another fight with Bibi Netanyahu? How well did that work out for us in 2009, 2011? Dan Kurtzer may stick up for you, but we know from experience that the weight of the organized Jewish community is going to come down like a ton of bricks on our head. The Israeli government is going to fight us tooth and nail. The Palestinian leadership is so weak that we're not sure they can deliver anyway. And if you haven't noticed, there are a lot of other issues out in the world. There's a big place called Asia, for instance, where we have fundamentally important interests at stake that haven't really been tended to, with a lot less political tsaras to deal with in Washington if we try to handle them. So how can you tell me that this should be issue number 1 or 2 on the president's foreign policy agenda?
Look, I would say to the president, that's a very strong argument, and there's no easy way to overcome it. But there's 2 considerations that, as president, he needs to bear in mind. One, on the negative side, is if you don't try to fix this thing, you're going to end up periodically spending a lot of time, a lot of capital, and a lot of energy putting out small fires. Presidents off in Asia during this Gaza crisis, and we know from the White House spokesman that he's spending hours of the day, including until, I think, last night, 3 o'clock in the morning, making phone calls to the Middle East and dispatching Secretary Clinton to the Middle East. So the negative, or I might say the not positive argument here is you can have a presidency beset by periodic but assured conflicts that you're going to spend a lot of time trying to put out these small fires. The more positive issue is this is a president who recognized from day one that resolving or trying to resolve this issue is an American national interest. And presidents need to think about doing big things, not being constrained by domestic groups that have a perfectly legitimate right to make their case, but the president needs to look at the larger national interest. Yes, we're going to have a fight domestically, and it'll probably carry over into the Congress, but this is why I would go back, Peter, to the need not for tactics here, but for an integrated strategy. I don't think the president has yet articulated a strong enough basis of policy around which to build a coalition that would cross the aisle in the Congress or attract very strong support in the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community. Just the idea of getting to negotiations or confidence-building measures doesn't do the trick. The president needs to come forward to the American people and say, I have a very good sense not only of how to do this, but what policy should guide our doing it. And this is what I'm going to try to do. I hope you stick with me. Give me a little time to play this out. I'm ready to hear contrary opinions, but this is what I think is best for the United States. And I would appeal to the president being president. It's a tough job. Buck stops there, but it's a moment in which he can really think big instead of thinking about being a fireman.
One last question. I know a lot of Jews of your generation and of your religious profile. And as you know, very few of them share your perspective on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Not none, but I think we could safely say it's very much a minority view. And so I wanted to ask you something a little more personal about how it is that you came to this particular perspective on this conflict, and to what degree, how successful you find that you've been able to be of convincing people of its wisdom close to home.
Look, it's hard to say this. I have spent more time in the Middle East, in Israel, in the Arab world, than anyone of the people you're talking about. I have had more contacts with people on the left in Israel and the Arab world and people on the right in Israel and the Arab world than any of the people you're talking about. I have friends that extend far beyond the normal range of the people you're talking about. So experience has been a great guide here. This is not a textbook case of thinking, sitting in a comfortable chair here in Princeton, New Jersey, and developing an idea. I've got a library, as you can see behind me, of ideas by people who have not spent as much time actually working on this issue in government and outside of government and in the region. So I don't accept the argument that somehow I'm the outlier. I think this is a hard issue for people to deal with. I think that's an emotional issue. The emotional safe ground is to basically say there is no conflict ending solution here. And so let's just try to figure out what we can do from day to day. And I frankly don't want to fate the people of Israel or the people of the Arab world to that kind of a non-solution. Status quos are not static. They get worse all the time unless you work on them. And as we see in this latest outbreak of violence in Gaza, you can't count on what looks like a stable situation to remain stable. So I push back when people make this argument. Again, I don't feel myself in any way being an outlier, nor do I feel that other people have illegitimate views. I think those are legitimate concerns. But I am absolutely persuaded, even after doing this for more than 35 years, that this is a conflict that is still amenable to resolution through partition and a fair agreement that meets the basic concerns of both sides. And I think that's what we have to strive for.
Well, I desperately hope that you're right. The book is called Pathways to Peace, America and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, edited by Daniel Kurtzer. You should all read it, and let's hope that people at the White House are reading it as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Peter.